In the last week of April 1945, in a village outside the Harz foothills, one of those places that didn't matter on any operations map but mattered to the people who lived there, a German mother stood in the doorway of a half-lit stairwell and listened to the night as if it were a radio. The power had been cut for days. The only light came from a stub of candle on a saucer, and from the faint orange wash of a distant fire where a barn had burned earlier in the evening. Whether by accident, by retreating troops, or by a careless flare, no one could say any more. She did not sleep. Not really. Sleep had become something you attempted in short pieces, like eating, whenever the moment allowed, whenever the child's breathing sounded steady enough to risk closing your eyes. Her son was small enough to be carried, old enough to ask questions. His hair smelled of smoke from the stove, of damp wool, of the sourness that clung to clothes when you had fewer changes than days. He had been crying earlier from hunger and then stopped, not because the hunger had passed, but because the body learns when crying costs more than it helps. She pulled his coat closer, then paused, because there was a sound again. Not close, not yet. A low, repeated vibration that did not belong to weather or trains. The village had learned the difference. Trains had a rhythm, a predictability, a distant squeal. This sound was heavier and uneven. It came in waves. It would fade, then return, as if something large was moving in fits and starts, stopping, turning, pushing forward again. Sometimes you heard it and nothing happened. Sometimes you heard it, and by morning the road was full of columns. She had learned, like everyone else, to translate the language of engines into probabilities, and the probability was getting worse. In the stairwell below her, an older woman, her mother, or an aunt, shifted on a wooden chair and whispered that they should wait, that it might pass, that the front had been elsewhere last week, and elsewhere the week before that. The words were soft, but the meaning was firm. Stay put, endure, don't draw attention, don't gamble. But the mother at the doorway did not answer, not because she disagreed, because she was doing arithmetic. On the table behind her, wrapped in a cloth, was what remained of their food, a heel of bread hard enough to scrape the palate, 2 potatoes, a small jar of turnip preserves that smelled faintly sweet and faintly wrong, a tin cup and a spoon that had outlasted everything else in the house. The ration cards existed, yes, somewhere in her pocket, folded carefully, as if paper could still command reality. But the cards were not food. They were reminders of a system that had stopped delivering. Beside the bread, there was another object, a document with an official stamp that no longer impressed anyone. It was an evacuation notice from days earlier, vague and contradictory, written as if the state still controlled roads and trains. It listed assembly points and instructions, but there were no buses, no trains, no authority to enforce it. The men who posted notices had disappeared. The party official in the next street had packed his suitcase the night before and left without telling anyone where. The collapse was not a single moment. It was this, small absences accumulating until you realized the world had shifted and no one had announced it. She stepped out into the street. The night air carried the smells of early spring, wet soil, manure from the fields, smoke from coal and burned wood. Somewhere nearby, a cow lowed once, confused, then quiet again. In the distance, there were faint flashes, too far to be lightning. The sound arrived long after the light, a flat rumble that made the glass in the window frames tremble. She kept her voice low, not because anyone had told her to, but because she had spent years learning that loudness was dangerous. She crossed the street to the neighbor's house. The neighbor opened the door immediately, as if he had been standing behind it waiting. He was a man in his late 50s, with the hollowed face of someone who had lost weight too quickly. He had no uniform. Most men did not anymore. Those who still had uniforms were either too young, too old, or too unlucky. He did not ask why she had come. He said, "They're saying the Americans are already near." She asked, "Who's saying?" He shrugged. That was the answer now. People. A bicycle messenger. A man who had walked through from a town 20 kilometers away. A farmer who had seen aircraft overhead and assumed the direction. a rumor that had moved faster than the columns because rumor did not need fuel. Then he added, after a pause, quieter, as if the street itself might overhear. And the other side, the ones from the east. They're closer than people thought. He did not say more. He did not need to. She thanked him with a nod that was automatic and went back to her doorway. Inside, her child looked up at her, eyes wide in the candlelight, watching her face like it was a clock. Children in those conditions learn to read expressions the way adults read newspapers. He could tell she was not deciding whether to go outside. He could tell she was deciding whether to leave the world he knew. She knelt and began to prepare him without speaking. First, socks. Another pair if possible. In April, the cold still lived in the ground, and wet feet became sickness faster than hunger. She found socks that didn't match and pulled them on anyway. Then, scarf. She wrapped it twice, tight enough to hold warmth, loose enough that he could breathe. Then, the coat, too large, once bought for next winter, now worn because there might not be a next winter worth planning for. Then, the bag. She did not pack like someone going to visit family. She packed like someone going to cross a line. A small bundle of clothing, folded as tightly as possible. The ration card still. A photograph. One that had survived because it was kept in the same place as the documents that mattered. A piece of soap worn down to a thin sliver. A small sewing kit, needle, thread, a single spare button. This was not sentimentality. It was field logic. A torn coat becomes a problem if you have no way to close it. And then the hardest part, the decision of what not to take. A blanket was heavy. A blanket could also be life. She folded one, then unfolded it again, calculating weight against distance. She chose a thinner one and told herself she could find shelter before night returned. When she was almost finished, the older woman in the stairwell spoke again, sharper now. "Where are you going?" The mother didn't answer at first because the question contained a trap. If she said it out loud, it would become real, and reality demanded more courage than imagination. But then she said it simply. West. Not to the Americans. Just west. The older woman inhaled as if to protest, then stopped. Her eyes moved to the child, then to the bag, then back to the mother's face. She understood what west meant without requiring explanation. They had all heard the same fragments. The woman from the next village whose cousin had fled from Silesia. The stories that arrived with refugees in torn coats and mud-caked shoes. People who did not embellish because they were too tired to perform. They did not describe details. They used careful words. They spoke of what it would cost. They spoke of what happens when the wrong troops arrive first. They spoke of things you cannot undo. That kind of language spreads because it is incomplete. It lets the listener fill the rest with their own fear. The mother tightened the strap of the bag. She lifted the child onto her hip and felt how light he had become. Not small, light. That distinction was terrifying. She stepped outside. There was no music. There was no heroic resolve. There was only the crunch of her boots on gravel, the drag of the bag against her side, and the fact that she kept her eyes forward because if she looked back at the stairwell, she might stop. At the edge of the village, the road opened into fields. The moonlight reflected in shallow puddles. The trees were bare enough to show the horizon. And then, for the first time that night, she heard something different. Not artillery. Voices. Faint, carried on the wind. English words she could not understand, followed by a short burst of laughter that did not sound like hysteria or cruelty. Just tiredness. Human voices. American voices. She stopped behind a low hedge and waited, pressing her child's head into her shoulder so he wouldn't see first. Her heart did not race like it did in stories. It moved slowly, heavily, like something trying to remain steady under weight. In the dark, she could make out shapes, helmets, the outlines of rifles, men moving along the roadside in a loose discipline, scanning left and right. A vehicle's engine idled somewhere behind them, low and controlled, not revving, not shouting its presence. One of the soldiers raised his hand, palm open, in a signal that meant hold. Another stepped forward slightly, aiming a flashlight toward the hedge, then lowering it. Careful not to blind, careful not to provoke. She swallowed and stepped out. The soldier's posture shifted instantly, not to panic, but to readiness. His rifle remained pointed down, not at her, but not away either. He said something, quick and controlled, and another soldier moved to his flank. Then the first soldier spoke again, slower this time, as if he understood that volume was not the issue. "Ma'am, stop there." She understood only the tone, and she stopped. Her child made a small sound, half question, half fear, and she tightened her arm around him. The American took a step closer, close enough that she could see his face under the helmet. Young, unshaven, eyes rimmed with fatigue, mud on his trousers up to the knee. A cigarette smell mixed with engine oil. On his shoulder, a patch she did not recognize. He looked at the child for a fraction of a second, just long enough for her to see something in his expression that was not hatred, not warmth, but recognition. He had seen children like this already. He spoke again, and this time he gestured, not with a weapon, but with his hand, pointing down the road. "Come, this way." She did not relax. Not yet. But she took a step, because in that moment, the war stopped being a distant map and became a narrow corridor of choices, and she had already chosen. The country became a place where rules still existed on paper, but the people who enforced them were gone, or were enforcing something else entirely, depending on which direction the wind was blowing. If you lived inside it, the collapse wasn't announced. You felt it in small absences, in delays, in doors that no one answered, in stamps that meant nothing. A mother in that period could tell you exactly when the state stopped being a structure and started being a rumor. It was the morning she walked to the bakery with ration cards and found the bakery shuttered, not because the baker was lazy, but because there was no flour, no delivery, no coal for the oven. The baker's son had been drafted months earlier, and the baker himself had been sent out to dig anti-tank ditches with a shovel and a paper armband that said he belonged to a defense unit that had no rifles. It was the day she queued outside the local office, what used to be called the rat house, or sometimes just the place where you went when you needed permission. And the clerk behind the desk looked up and said quietly that he could not help her, because the forms were gone, because the records had been moved, because the man who signed the papers had left last night with a suitcase. Collapse did not look like chaos everywhere at once. It looked like administration turning into improvisation. By April, whole districts were governed by whoever happened to still be there. A tired police sergeant with 3 men left under his command, a party official who suddenly became polite and spoke about order with the voice of someone trying to save himself, a school teacher forced into the role of warden because the previous warden had disappeared. In some towns, you could still see the outlines of authority, posters, loudspeakers, lists, but the machinery behind them had broken. The rail lines ran when they ran. The telephones worked when they worked. Electricity came and went, and people stopped reacting to the lights flickering because reaction wastes energy and energy was precious. You can measure the collapse in the kinds of messages people began receiving. Not orders, warnings, not instructions, suggestions. Prepare to evacuate. Remain calm. Maintain discipline. The language of a government that no longer had the means to enforce its own sentences. And beneath those notices, the real system operated. Gossip, instinct, fear, and the brutal logic of geography. If you lived near a bridge, you learned to expect explosions. If you lived near a road, you learned to expect columns. If you lived near a forest, you learned to expect men without uniforms, some retreating, some hiding, some looking for food, some looking for someone to blame. In the last months, Germans could no longer rely on a single chain of command because there was no single chain of command. There were fragments, competing authorities, little fiefdoms that rose and dissolved within days. A Wehrmacht officer might still issue orders at the edge of town in the morning. By evening, the same officer might be gone, and the men who remained might have relabeled themselves as Volkssturm, local militia, because the difference had become meaningless. Most of them were not soldiers in any professional sense. They were old men with worn-out World War I belts, boys with rifles too long for their arms, civil servants with armbands and no ammunition. They had been given slogans, not training. If you walked past them on a road, you could see it in their posture. They stood like men waiting to be swallowed. And the truth is, in many places, the local authorities knew it. They simply did not say it out loud, because saying it out loud was treason yesterday. And yesterday's laws did not stop applying until someone was sure there would be no punishment. That uncertainty, the half-second delay between what everyone understood and what anyone dared to admit, was one of the most corrosive features of the collapse. It created a country where people lived in two realities at once. One reality was public, flags still hanging, slogans still painted on walls, radio announcements that spoke of holding and resistance. The other reality was private, women trading wedding rings for sacks of flour, men burying uniforms in gardens, families packing suitcases in silence because they knew the front was coming and they had no idea whose front it would be. Even within the armed forces, structure was fraying. A unit that existed on paper might not exist in the field. A company might be down to a platoon. A platoon might be down to a handful of men. Ammunition came in mixed crates. A rifleman might carry French rounds in one pocket and German rounds in the other, because that was what had been scavenged. Fuel was the great limiter. A tank without fuel was a bunker that could be bypassed. A truck without fuel was a pile of wood and rubber. A horse was suddenly valuable in a way no modern army likes to admit. If you watched the roads, you saw it. Carts again, hand carts, bicycles loaded with bundles. Women pushing prams not with babies but with bedding and potatoes. The old industrial rhythm of the state, the trains, the schedules, the depots, was breaking into the older rhythm of survival. What you could carry, what you could trade, what you could hide. And that collapse created a specific kind of fear that mattered for this story. Because when a system is intact, civilians can tell themselves, there is a plan. Even if it's a bad plan, it's a plan. When the system is gone, civilians understand something that military men sometimes forget. They are now negotiating directly with fate. The mother in our opening didn't wake up one day and decide she trusted Americans. Trust is too clean a word. She woke up in a Germany where there was no longer a reliable inside and outside. The front line was not a line, it was a smear. It moved overnight. It moved with rumors. It moved with the sound of engines. You could be behind the front at dawn and in front of it by midnight, simply because someone took the wrong road and a column appeared where the map said it wouldn't. This is why people began fleeing not just from combat, but from uncertainty itself. The roads filled with families who could not explain precisely what they were running from, only that they had learned to read the signs. The sudden silence of officials, the disappearance of police patrols, the empty windows of party buildings, the smell of paper burning from offices where records were being destroyed. A functioning state keeps records. A collapsing state burns them. That is one of the most concrete signals of the end. The recognition that tomorrow's accountability has become more dangerous than today's logistics. By late April, in many towns, you could watch this happening. Men carrying boxes out of municipal buildings, shredded paper in the gutters, smoke rising from behind walls that had once represented permanence, people pretending they didn't see, because seeing meant responsibility. Alongside the administrative collapse came the moral collapse, the quieter, uglier one that doesn't show in maps. In a functioning system, there is a predictable relationship between civilians and authority. You know what happens if you break rules. You know what happens if you comply. You know where the boundaries are. In the collapse, boundaries blur. A woman could be stopped by a man in uniform, asked for papers, and not know whether the uniform meant anything beyond the man's hunger. She could meet a group of soldiers who demanded food for the front, and then learn an hour later that those soldiers had deserted 2 days ago and were simply using the language of the state as a weapon. In that environment, the safest strategy was to minimize contact. Travel quietly, speak little, carry what you can, keep the child close. Avoid men in groups, whether they wore uniforms or not. This is what Germany without structure actually meant on the ground. Not anarchy everywhere, but 1,000 small local vacuums where rules depended on who had a gun and whether they still cared about tomorrow. And into that landscape came the Americans, not as an abstract Western allies, as a moving administrative machine. That's the contrast that will matter later. Even before you talk about kindness, even before you talk about chocolate or rations, the first thing a civilian notices is structure. American columns moved with MPs at crossings, with signage, with traffic control, with engineers repairing roads. They moved with paperwork, with lists, with procedures. Even under combat conditions, they carried the habits of a system that expected to still exist next week. For a German mother coming out of collapse, that alone could be shocking, because the Reich had promised order and delivered disintegration. And here, in the middle of German ruin, were young foreign soldiers who seemed to belong to a machine that still worked. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough to feel like a world you could predict. And for a parent holding a child in a country where prediction had died, predictability was not comfort. It was survival. No official bulletin announced it. No poster carried the wording plainly. But by early 1945, in central and eastern Germany, the direction of fear had a compass bearing. It pointed east. The advance of the Red Army was not a rumor in the abstract. It was a movement measured in rail schedules that no longer ran, in roads that clogged overnight, in towns that stopped sending letters because the postal routes had broken.